This is Axon, the Air University Teaching and Learning Center podcast. At Axon, we make connections between teachers, learners, and ideas in military education. The opinions, conclusions, and recommendations expressed or implied in this podcast are solely those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the views of Air University, the United States Air Force, the Department of Defense, or any other U.S. government agency. Follow us online at www.airuniversity.af.edu/TLC or on Twitter at AirTeaching for more.
Welcome to the Axon podcast. This is the official podcast of the Air University Teaching and Learning Center. And I'm so happy today to be with Brian McDermott. This is Dr. Megan Hennessy. I'm your host today. Brian McDermott retired as a lieutenant colonel after serving 20 years as a Marine Corps aviator. I first met Brian when we taught together at the Marine Corps Expeditionary Warfare School, and he was also the Marine Corps University Red Team Director. Brian and I worked together again at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency College, and he has since also served as a tactical red team analyst at the Joint Improvised Threat Defeat Organization and the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. He currently works as an instructional systems design lead for ODNI and as a part-time adjunct professor at the MCU College of Distance Education and Training continuing education program for an asynchronous online red team course he designed. Hey, Brian, welcome.
Good morning, Megan. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's nice to hear your voice again. It's been a while. It's always good to have Marine Corps buds join us. And today
Absolutely.
We're really going to take advantage of all of your expertise on red teaming. So first, spell it out to us. Why is red teaming important in military education?
No, thanks for the question, Megan. So first I want to do, because there's some publications out there, Joint Pub 5, Joint Pub 2, and others that define it. So basically, I'm using the Red Team Handbook just to give context for the definition. Basically, it's a flexible cognitive approach to thinking that's specifically tailored to each organization and each situation. When doing this, it helps the learners that I've seen in the education world help ask better questions, challenge assumptions, especially those implicit assumptions, expose information you might not have thought of in the first time that you were looking at a topic or issue, and also develop alternatives that might be there. What's the, with this information, what are the other explanations or other ways that this could be viewed? And it helps the learner rapidly shift between multiple perspectives to develop a fuller appreciation of whatever the topic is that they're doing. And, so for red teaming, I base it off of the 4 pillars of the old Army Red Team School, known as the University of Foreign Military Cultural Studies. They shut their doors in October 2021. But they basically talk about how these techniques can help with self-awareness and reflection, which actually ties into critical thinking. The other pillar is applied critical thinking to help get to the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy that these techniques can help the learner get to. Also, with applied critical thinking, it also helps foster cultural empathy. If you don't like the word empathy, others can say cultural awareness. And it's not just looking, obviously, at, I'll say another culture like, the U.S. culture or the Chinese culture, but also in internal organizational culture. What's a culture of the Marines? What's a culture of Air Force personnel, et cetera? And then also all these wrap into what you can do is group think mitigation. So if you see a bunch of people agreeing on a topic and there hasn't been a lot of debate, this is where as an educator, you can actually use some of the techniques in order to throw another question out there or a technique to help expose and take an opposite viewpoint to help the learners get to that, to help take a holistic approach to the topic or issue that's being presented in the classroom.
Can you give us like an example? Can we run through how you might teach this? If you were teaching your red teaming course, how would you teach it as an instructional tool, like you just said?
No, absolutely. So what I do is it's mainly more on the facilitation side. There's certain facilitation techniques. There's also some structured analytic techniques that are used in this approach toward red teaming. So in the educational space, I can use the course that I designed. So for 18 weeks, most of the course that the learners are in, which I'm currently teaching with Marine Corps University, they have to think from either the Chinese or the Russian perspective. I based the curriculum around the current national defense strategy, and I'm able to use facilitation techniques in the as what I would say the asynchronous environment's a little bit tougher than the synchronous environment, whether you're in person or live online, because you have to make sure all the instructions are put out there. So I use certain techniques like think, write, share, which combines with maybe another facilitation technique like 1, 2, 4 whole group, in order to make sure that the learners are diving into the material and challenging each other. So, one of the things as a facilitator I do is if I'm seeing everyone say, hey, I agree with your point, I agree with your point, and you don't say why they're agreeing with it, well, then I'll ask a deeper level question, maybe use another questioning technique, like modified 5 whys, or if I were to use a 4 ways of seeing technique to say, hey, how would the Russian perspective see this topic, or how would the Russians see Americans related to this kind of topic. So there's different ways to try and engage self-awareness and reflection on the learner's answers. So then they dive into critical thinking, more even creative thinking, and really get into the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, maybe the analyze or hopefully to evaluate or create sections to where they can create new thought and then be able to defend, I'll call it an argument, defend their argument or defend their assessment with the material that they use in order to design it, and also see a different way on how that material could be interpreted. So they can anticipate those kind of questions that might be asked of them and maintain an open mind and a growth mindset in the classroom setting.
Yeah, that all makes good sense to me as an educator and as an educational researcher. What you just spoke to is actually one of the weaknesses that my co-researcher, Dr. Tino Perez, retired Army colonel, and I discovered together with our collaborator, Dr. Brandy Jenner, when we looked at how senior service college students solve problems and how they present strategies and strategic level products. So one of our findings was that there was a real weakness or just complete gap in counter argumentation and very little perspective taking or cognizance around local dynamics of war. So what you're saying definitely resonates with what I've seen in my experience. I did want to ask you, what are the 5 whys?
So 5 whys is a questioning type technique where it helps dive in. You do a deeper dive into finding, I'll say, a root cause of an issue, or if you're looking at like a case study of, hey, for example, why did the Malaysians start an insurgency, in the late 50s and 60s that the British had to deal with? So in that case of a case study, you ask those questions and dive deeper into what were those root grievances, at least in the example I just gave, or more like a root cause of what makes you think the way you do. And obviously it's based on what we experience, and as well as our educational background in the past, how we're raised, but also there are cognitive biases out there. I'm sure everyone's familiar with. Basically, it's just the way the brain is hardwired. We're in 2021, and our brain is still hardwired like it was when we were slinging clubs and arrows and spears at animals, and we weren't the top of the food chain at that time as well. So our brains are still nested in that, hardwired that way. So these techniques can help, like 5 whys can help dig. And what I've also noticed is once you understand the techniques, you can modify them how you need to. So what I've seen sometimes with 5 whys, if someone tries circling back to their original viewpoint, instead of asking another why question, I'll ask a how question to change their lens and how they're trying to support their answer or support the argument or assessment that they came with.
Yeah. So, how do the instructors who are learning these techniques from you feel about this? Is it uncomfortable? Is it new information to them? What's, some of their insights that you've garnered?
Well, I think some people, if it's new to them, obviously everyone is human nature a little uncomfortable with new things. But the key is doing the practice stuff. And I'll say this: I like to think I'm pretty good at what I do, but I've learned from my mistakes and as well as my successes. So I would just say, if you keep a growth mindset and open mind to how to utilize these things, I'll say some of the positive things I've heard is that using these kind of techniques, it helps enhance the learning environment. It gets more buy-in from the learners, because by using these kind of techniques like think, write, share, and circle of voices, and some other techniques, you're putting burden of answering on the learners, especially in a seminar type environment. So instead of me being the instructor, being the sage on the stage, I'm more of a guide on the side with some background knowledge in case I'm asked questions myself. And this is where I'd rather have the learners engage with themselves. So it enhances the learning environment. It helps provide different type of perspectives, especially I'll use my example in with Expedition Warfare School. We had, I think it was 22 or 23 international students. So helping them feel more comfortable in sharing their experiences, especially when it's just one of them in a room of anywhere from 18 to 20 American military officers. The other thing that helps with that increased participation, if you're using some of these facilitation techniques, this will get the learners to dive deeper, and in my opinion, with some research and trying to reach metacognition, we'll get them in those higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy to really reach or exceed the educational objectives of any program that you're in. And the reason why I would say this is important is if you look at the Joint Chiefs of Staff instructional literature out there, there's one order for officer PME, the other one that is for enlisted PME. And if you look through a lot of the literature in those two orders, a lot of them dive back into how the leader can think critically through these things. And this is where some red team facilitation techniques, even in the seminar level, I think would help achieve or help meet or exceed those learning objectives set out in a curriculum.
Thanks. Is there any experience that you've had where this has just, I'm going to force you to use your growth mindset here. Is there any experience that you've had that red teaming has just completely made you fall on your face and you think later, oh, that was not the best use of that tool, or think about it in terms of what you might have done differently?
Oh, absolutely. So one of the things that I did not do well in an educational mindset was I was with a seminar with some other international officers, and I was really pushing. This is where I had a closed mindset based on a topic. It was about something in Europe about an operation that was going on, and I wanted the international students to better see the American perspective, and I kept harping on the American perspective, and I did use Think Right Share, and I didn't use Circle of Voices correctly. I cut them off, due to time. Usually Circle of Voices, everyone gets to share their opinion, and then you build off of each other's opinion, not your own. That's the basics of that technique. There's also circular response, where everyone builds on somebody else's answer, and it might be completely different than how the answer originally started. So I was working so hard, I did not appreciate the international officer's perspective, and they called me out on it, thankfully, respectfully, at the end of the seminar. And that's when I realized, when I did some more self-reflection on how I did that, that's where I realized that I need to learn to better appreciate other people's perspectives to achieve the learning objectives, and so at least in this case, the American officers can better understand a completely different perspective, because the international officer's mindset and education was a lot different than the American officers at that time.
Right, thanks. And yeah, I'll just make a plug because we had Professor Stacy Wells on the podcast this week that went live. It'll be a couple weeks out by the time this one goes live on our streaming platforms, but she specifically talks about the role that international military officers have to play in PME. So it sounds like you're doubling down on that. And I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I'd like to give a quick example about that. So when I was at Expedition Warfare School, at all our American, I was there from 2010 to 11, I think, or 12. And so this is when a lot of the American officers had experience in counterinsurgency operations in Iraq or Afghanistan. And we had a Philippine Marine officer, we called him Charlie. He spoke better English than any of us. But, obviously, the Philippine military has been handling an insurgency for now almost 7 decades, at that time 6 decades. And I asked my fellow learners in the seminars, hey, do they want to ask Charlie their opinion about counterinsurgency? And they're like, well, why would we do that? I'm like, well, his country's been fighting in counterinsurgency for over 6 decades. Why don't you talk to him about? And he's been doing it in archipelagos. It's not a land thing. It's various small islands, all sorts of, very dynamic environment that and tough environment that you have to do this in. And they started asking him a lot of questions because he was pretty reserved, but his experience, I think, greatly enhanced the lessons learned from what the Americans did in Iraq and Afghanistan, and maybe might utilize some of those lessons learned in future operations.
Thanks so much for that perspective. I think that's so important for us all to keep in mind as we're working in military learning environments. So I asked you about your failure. What's the greatest success that you've seen with red teaming?
So I think the greatest success, it's a little bit different than in the educational world. So when I was a strategic red team analyst lead at DITRA, I cannot remember the acronym what it stands for, but it's basically OIOA director, who was a U.S. general officer in the Army. They wanted to use red teaming to help design a new mission and vision statement. And their original thing was they just wanted us to, and I'll give him that officer a lot of credit. He also wanted to include contractors in on this process, because at that time, about 85% of the workforce was contractors. So he had military personnel, I'll say government blue badge personnel, and contractors. And I had very little time to set this up, but I used some basic facilitation techniques like think, write, share, based on the publication that the general officer wanted everyone to use as a reference. And we had to get all our questions validated by, I'll just say, legal, because of what the general was asking. And what this allowed was different parts of the organization to talk about change, or talk about current mission, what they thought it was, what they thought it could be, what the values of the organization are, and other types of questions like that. And then we took all the quantity, and I used Think, Write, Share, and I used Circle of Voices when I personally facilitated my seminars, and I gave some educational quick tips of some of these techniques to some of my fellow colleagues that they didn't have as extensive background in facilitation as I did. Overall, I thought we were really successful. We took all the quantitative and turned it into qualitative data. I wrote the methodology for the point paper. The other one other red team person we had certified on the team, he presented a paper. I moved on to another job by the time this was over. And I had heard after they got the report and the debrief from what the red team did, they actually wanted both of us, but since I moved on, they kept the other red team person to stay on and help the key leadership, the GS 14s, 15s, and the general officer and whoever in his staff, to help craft that new mission statement, craft that new vision statement. I'd say that was a good success story. Part of it is I had a former senior leader in the Army, and he was a CETA contractor. And I won't use the exact language he did when he was part of this. He told me it was a bunch of bupkis and other words I won't use. But after he went through the experience with me, because I made sure I facilitated the group he was in, he really appreciated how he was able to hear different perspectives on some information he did not think about or did not consider as the organization was looking at that reshuffle. And what I would take from that is, this allowed buy-in from the participants. This allowed critical thinking to be used at all various levels from all various different backgrounds. And the information that we gathered was much greater than any traditional survey that would have been given. Gave a lot more depth and breadth to the information, to the qualitative data. And then, we use some analysis to do the quantitative data, and I think that helped that organization. So this is where I say red teaming can be used in various different methods. And in that case, I would say the education for the workforce was, there is a way to appreciate everyone's perspective, appreciate everyone's input. And even though it might not have been used in its original form, the synthesis that happened and maybe got to the higher Bloom's taxonomy, where the key leaders had to evaluate the information they got and analyze it and then create new information. I think that's a good success story of what red teaming can do. I know that was more of an organizational type environment, but I have used these techniques, and others that I know have used red teaming techniques, the facilitation side of stuff, have achieved or exceeded their learning objectives. And it ties back into those joint chief chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff instructions, which I know all the other services had to use as a guideline in order to develop their programs for their military education opportunities for officers and enlisted.
Well, sign me up. How do I learn how to use red teaming techniques? You've made a very strong case. If I'm a PME faculty member or someone working at one of the other schoolhouses more along a training bent, how do I learn how to use these techniques?
Well, so I know the school is closed. The Army Red Team School is closed. So there are some certified Red Team facilitators that are out there. I know some, as well as myself. I know one way that this could be done is for faculty development. I gave my services as my LLC offer to Marine Corps University College of Distance Education and Training, that I can do this for them and help maybe enhance how the questions that are formed in the discussion threads, and also using these techniques in order to even for an online environment or even in person to maximize the thinking and the interaction of ideas and the exchange of ideas amongst the learners in the timeline that they have. I know myself and others like me that learn from the actual Red Team School. We can do this also on a separate case basis. I can be reached out on LinkedIn or give me a call or an email. And I know others that if you don't want me, which is fine, I'm happy to give you very credible people that can help enhance this type of facilitation techniques in a classroom type environment, whether live or asynchronous.
Thanks, Brian. That's awesome. Is there anything else you want to leave us with today about red teaming?
I just like to offer that it's not red teaming is not groundbreaking stuff. It's used a lot of certified research from various authors. I won't get into all of them, but if you do want to reference some references, I'm happy to provide those, whether they're Army pubs or whether they're joint pubs, or also maybe some research that was done by, for example, Dr. Randy Foster, who was on a curriculum development team, and he's done red teaming for a long time.
Thank you. That's great. And for any of our listeners who want to get in touch with Brian, if you can't find him on LinkedIn, just send us a note in the Teaching and Learning Center, and we will make sure that we connect you. So, Brian McDermott, thank you so much, and Semper Fi.
Thank you so very much, Megan, for this opportunity. I hope you have a good day, and Semper Fidelis to you also.
Thank you for listening to Axon, the Air University Teaching and Learning Center podcast. Stay current on these and other ideas in military education by following us online at www.airuniversity.af.edu/TLC or on Twitter @AirTeaching.